So I have the advantage of having a related paper, which means Anke has done all the hard work for me and given you all of the background that this work is based upon, so that's very useful. So all of those concepts around design spaces and the design framework is, whenever I talk about frameworks and design spaces, that's exactly what I'm referring to. So as Anke mentioned at the start of the talk, when we first started developing this work, we did a very extensive literature review, and we were looking at design from several different aspects, from sort of traditional software engineering and from general design, from interaction design, from participatory design and so on, and also based on our own experiences. And we sort of worked through those areas in order to develop and start instantiating our ideas into this framework. So the work that I'm going to talk about now was really us taking a big step back from that and saying, okay, we have this idea, and we think this seems to satisfy the criteria that we started with in terms of allowing us to have this way of reflecting on the design process. Let's step away from theory and go into practice and see how this actually fits into a more real-world situation. Right? I dislike the sort of term real world, but you know what I mean. You know, people actually doing design. So the idea was to run some case studies where we wanted to do two quite distinct things. So the first was to actually evaluate the applicability of the framework. If we take some design that's actually happening, a design process, does it in any way fit or make sense with the framework that we've developed? Because if it doesn't, we're already in trouble, right? You know, if there's no correspondence between these things, then we have a problem. And then the second thing was to sort of take our own medicine. As we're going through this process, it may well be that we uncover things that we hadn't thought of previously. We, you know, as Anke said, we believed we had something that was comprehensive, but it could be that as we started actually burrowing down and viewing these practices actually happening, that we were going to find gaps, that we were going to find areas that didn't really fit, or that things were going to stand out that we haven't thought of. So this is sort of an initial foray into that. So they're two quite small case studies as first step into that work. So the first case study was with a commercial web development company. It was with a company that's local to me in New Zealand, and they were undertaking a 6-month project to upgrade a website of a commercial business, and that involved a team of 6 who were I think about 4 of them were in the town where my university is based, and 2 of them were remotely located in another city 160 kilometers away, and that's where the client was as well. And so they very kindly let us inject our researcher into their process, who did an observational study, which meant she took part in all of their design meetings. She had access to the design artifacts. She was able to observe the meetings, take notes, record them, and so on. And then as a contrast to that, we ran a more artificial design study that we set up purely for the purposes of this project, where we took 4 undergraduate students, we gave them a design task, and we said, you know, we didn't mandate how long they had to do it, but they set themselves up to have these 4 meetings, and the same researcher performed the same kind of observational study as part of that. So at the end of both of these processes, then of course she had all of her data and coded up the results. And they sort of fell broadly into 4 categories around the teams that were involved in the design, the artifacts, and as Anke already said, you know, everything is a design artifact. So, you know, a discussion or an argumentation or a requirement or an actual prototype, all of these things have the same value within the design framework. And then she sort of teased out as well from that coding the decision points, like when decisions were actually made, and looked at the requirements and the evolving requirements that happened. And that was sort of the first thing that stood out to us was that I've only got 3 minutes, so I need to speed up, was that we knew that there were going to be constraints from the requirements, but actually, apart from the explicit constraints, which were, you know, stated, there were also a lot of implicit constraints that had a really big impact on the design. So just as an example, within the commercial team, there was a dynamic that meant that the project manager had the final say on everything. So if that person made a decision and it went against some of the previous decisions that had come out from meetings, that decision held. And then with the student team, what happened was they got very constrained by time. So they would spend, 50 of their 60 minutes thinking about ideas, and then suddenly they'd go, oh, we've only got 10 minutes, and then they would come to a very quick decision and often discard a lot of their ideas. So this is a visual representation of the coding for the commercial project, so the explanation of that is in the paper. And then we mapped that to the framework, and again, this is just the first case study, just to see if we could elicit some of those ideas that Anke talked about, things like where decisions were made, where variance occurred, where alternatives occurred, and we have an example between those two bottom design spaces where we have a set of alternatives leave a design space, enter into another design space, and then get resolved. And in fact, if you tie that back to the previous image, what you see is that was the client making a decision from the set of final prototypes they were given. So our conclusions were that we could use the framework and we could use it to reflect on the process in the way that we'd hoped. And there's this sort of notion of zooming in and zooming out. So the image that I flicked over really quickly, and I said that's a visual representation of the coding. Actually, what that turns out to be is, if you imagine that these sort of images of the design spaces are quite high level and quite abstract, if you were to zoom in on one of these and really look at the details of that, you get something that's more akin to the coded information. So we're still sort of maintaining all of that richness, we're just viewing it from sort of further away. But the implicit constraints are not evident anywhere in the framework, and that's a much harder thing to understand. So if you can't capture those in some way, you always run into the danger of sort of seeing this strange disconnect, perhaps, between a process and then a decision coming out the other end, where there's a mismatch between that. The nice thing about the framework, however, is you can see that that decision was made. So future work, we need to do some larger empirical studies. This was really us just dipping our toe in the water, right? Going, let's just try this out and see what happens. So now that we've got a better feel for it, we'd like to sort of do larger studies using the framework as a sort of descriptive and reflective tool. And then the other thing, which again Anke touched on very briefly, is that the description, if you look at even the complex design spaces, they suggest a very static process where everything is fixed in time. And of course, that's really not true. So the work we've been doing since this initial work, and work that's still ongoing, is looking at things like traces of the history and some of the temporal properties that occur within the process, so that we can understand better not just how things happen, but when things happen and the implications that may have as well. So just finally, I'd really like to thank Cassie Yang, who was the researcher who did all of the grunt work on this, was doing all of the studies, and particularly the commercial company who allowed us to spy on them, and their client who also gave permission for that. And thanks all to the students who took part in the study, and thank you to you guys for all listening to the talk. Thank you very much.
So again, we have time for one or two questions. Yep.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you see some kind of applying trees in a practical level. Do you see that it can be beneficial for designers themselves to understand the process, or you think it's more like a conceptual kind of way of structuring and understanding the design process?
I think both of those things. I think, designers need to obviously be able to reflect on their own processes, and increasingly, particularly in the area of research where I more often sit, which is around safety critical systems, there is a real need to be able to constructively look at the design process and understand how and why things happened. I think designers do reflect anyway. It just gives them perhaps another lens to look through.
Okay. And you think it should be like in a digital kind of way, or?
No. I don't want to go down the route of saying, here's the tool, do this thing.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question if needed. Yep, just behind you. Yep.
for your talk. Can we say that the main goal of your model is to support traceability, to keep track, and to keep the relationship so that when you want to make update of your design or your software or your interface, you can go back to the roots that generated some design decisions?
You can certainly say that's a large part of it, absolutely, yes. And not just for, not just the traceability for when you're changing things, but traceability for, you know, proving in some respect that you have the right thing.
Okay, okay. Just want to be sure if I understood. Thank you.
For sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.